Hi everyone. This video is here to explicate how to write up your findings. So how to move from your graphic organizer to findings, how to organize different thematic ways of writing in findings, how to provide evidence for your claims, and then just a little bit about the analysis paragraph. So you have a qualitative descriptive analysis graphic organizer that you filled out. You should have already been coding everything. You've got a list of codes, and these codes you have clumped into themes or categories, right? And so again, being really specific about our words, coding codes are lower level, themes and categories are higher level. You might have hopefully, based on a different video, looked at relationships between those themes or between the codes, all right? Now, within your set of things here, you're going to have some claims. So sometimes those are in memos and sometimes those are in the definition. I'm going to give you an example. Here is a claim right here. Accountability and Common Core were primarily described as degrading, undermining, or blocking efforts to establish science education reform. So I'm making kind of a slightly generalistic claim, all right? What's really great is I already have evidence right here in my graphic organizer to support that claim. So this can actually become, you already have your organization for your findings, your themes, you have your sub-themes, your codes, and then you have your claims. And sometimes the memos are broad like that, like they make a good claim, and sometimes they are good for interpreting the quote. And we're going to talk about both of those things here in a moment. Okay, so I'm going to go over 3 different ways to organize your findings. Now, for the pilot study, you only have one theme, so maybe this won't matter quite as much, but you still may have themes, processes, or narrative. But for your dissertation, if you're watching this and you're doing a dissertation, these things will matter a little bit more. So we all looked at Marion in class and did a discussion about how did she theme her findings, right? She's got 3 headings: implementing an inclusive community, creating conditions for pedagogic voicing, speaking for visions of individuals as community, and speaking with voices as contingent on emotionally engaged social partners. These are the themes that came out of her data. So and these are the ones that she felt were compelling. So it's not that this is everything that was in her data. Remember that in qualitative research, actually in all research, it is definitely grounded in the data, but what has emerged from the data is guided by her assumptions, her decisions about data collection, and especially her theory, her theoretical frameworks. So these are the compelling aspects within the data related to her research question, her theory, and these kinds of things. And we talked a little bit about this, but I'm going to pull up her paper to kind of show you again. So in the speaking for, she starts talking about this code, right? Or this is a theme, right? And she makes a claim through the creation of a responsive, literate context. She earnestly sought to, backing up. Here's her theme: speaking for visions of individuals and community. Within this, she has some codes or sub-themes, all right? So she says, for Stephanie, speaking for, on one hand, was a means to disrupt automated and uncritical responses. On the other hand, parent speaking for was about making visible to Stephanie the identities of their children. So she's got 2 sub-themes: Stephanie speaking for and parents speaking for. These were very likely codes, all right? They might have had even subcodes, all right? So that's just an example of here's the theme, right? Here's the overarching theme, speaking for, and then in this first paragraph, Narian introduces two subcodes, Stephanie and for parents, two different things. Then you can see that she goes on and starts to unpack Stephanie's. Stephanie's speaking for was most visible, etc. So she starts to unpack the first code, or the first sub-theme. All right. Now, I am going to give, so that's Narian. Another paper we're going to be working on unpacking during this time is the Hayes et al. 2019 paper that is more by process. So it's looking at something that happens over time or as an iterative set of processes in this case. And in that paper with subheadings, there's a process 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So there are 5 processes that are documented in the paper. I'm going to open it up. So scrolling upwards, here you can see process 5. So these are, and it's always good to have the headings, right? It's like very clear. This is one of my themes. Process 5, if you scroll up, you can see process 4 and so forth and so on. All right, I'm going to focus on process 5. So in process 5, there's a definition of the theme at the very top. This theme concerns how teachers made decisions about their curriculum in the context of a variety of pressures. All right, so that's the definition of the theme. Then I am saying there's 2 sub-themes. We highlight 2 prominent and iterative, I call them themes, but basically they're sub-themes. The legitimization afforded by integrating standards and stewardship in an age of standards and testing, and number 2, the role of stewardship in helping to authenticate standards. So I'm being very clear. I'm telling the reader, here's my theme, here's the definition of my theme, here's my 2 sub-themes, and then notice this cue here. The first theme, and then I go on and lay it out. All right, and we're going to get back to the use of evidence and laying out themes in a little bit. And then finally, you can organize it a lot of different ways, but I'm highlighting 3 ways. Another way is to organize it by narrative, and thanks to Dr. Strom, this is more her area, where it's kind of a sequential narrative, like especially if you're doing a case study, especially if it's a case study of a person, a lot of times a narrative is a great way to lay out your findings. So in this case, June's first year of teaching, this is from Dr. Strom's research, she had the headings, a rocky start, relationship and confidence building, and in a groove. So a rocky start, difficulties working out social norms with students, etc. Right, so here's kind of the sub-themes, right? So these are the codes, these things that she's laying out here. Here's the codes of this part of the narrative, of this part of the story. And then in a groove, here's the codes from this part of the story. She's beginning to emerge as a pedagogical leader, advocates for students, decides to go back to school. All right, so for some of you, the idea of like a story where the codes are part of a story that has themes may be a compelling way to organize. In all of those cases, there are certain things that happen with our way of doing research, all right? And this is not quite the case for every single thing, but it's pretty dang close. And this is a tool we actually use in science education broadly as well, which is the idea of claim evidence reasoning. So first you have a question, right? That's your research question. Based on that question and on the evidence, you have a claim. So this is your first answer to the question, right? It's like a partial answer to the question in many cases. Then you provide evidence to support that claim. So you provide a claim, and I'm going to give you a lot of examples. You provide evidence to support that claim. But that is incomplete without reasoning. Reasoning is a logical link, but it's also, in our case, a link to the broader literature and to our theoretical understanding of things. All right, so I'm going to I'm going to talk a little bit about the claims made in Narian and Hayes, the kinds of evidence that are provided, and how it's related back to theory through reasoning. Okay, so Narian. I already told you she's laid out her two sub-themes, her two codes, and then here is where she starts on the first sub-theme with a claim, right? So Stephanie's speaking for work, okay? And this is her claim. Through the creation of a responsive, literate context, she earnestly sought to establish the connectedness of Trevor within this classroom. She facilitated an academic model of identity for him. All right, so that's the claim. Now, I mean, you know, it's one thing if you're having, you know, a cup of tea with someone and you're like, yeah, I saw this teacher do this cool thing. She created this academic model of identity for him. And your friend's like, oh, cool, that's awesome. But in academic research, and maybe even your friend would do this, they might go, well, tell me about it. Like, what exactly happened? Like, how did she do it? And that's basically the conversation going on in your reader's head is like, well, that's awesome. But like, what happened? You know, give us an example of what's going on here. And so Narian uses a segment from her notes here. All right, and I'm just highlighting a piece of it, that she turned back to the group and reported that Trevor really liked the word crunch in the book. As the other students talked about the book and the words, Mariana volunteered, like Trevor, I like the word crunch. So she's giving an example of the teacher seeking to establish connectedness of Trevor, right? Now she has another claim. Stephanie was also observed on several occasions offering interpretations to the group about Trevor's nonverbal responses because Trevor's nonverbal. Okay, then she gives evidence. For example, when Trevor burst inexplicably into tears at the end of a storytelling session, Stephanie normalized this response by reminding the group that sometimes our emotions get the better of us. So notice here that in this case, she doesn't take a very big segment of text like she does here. She takes a, she uses just like a little, you know, an example from her notes and then like just a quote from her notes, right? So not as big of an example in this case, but same thing. You're sitting there telling your friend over coffee, hey, you know, like the teacher also offered interpretations to the group about these nonverbal responses. And your friend's like, wow, like, what's an example? And then you go, well, for example, when Trevor burst into tears, this is what she did, right? So you're giving the evidence to support your claim here, all right? And there's even another one here if you'd like to look at it. Now, in Narian, she embeds the reasoning, the theory into the findings. And she does it in the discussion as well, but it's much more in the findings than in the Hayes paper. So here is an example of the reasoning. Stephanie's attempt to facilitate student voicing through speaking for them did advance narrowly a democratic agenda for equitable participation. Her speaking for expanded her efforts to model to the students strategies to support self-expression among their peers. It modeled a form of voicing that could potentially generate a deeper sense of community, right? So she's taking this idea of Trevor not speaking, and so back up here, you know, he's not speaking, and she wants to create connectedness, and she does so through saying, you know, Trevor liked the word crunch, etc. And here she's citing the literature and saying, there's this connection where her doing this, she's creating this deeper sense of community, but she's disallowing debate and inquiry into the goals of the community and emphasizing compliance. So she's kind of analyzing the whole picture here using her theoretical stance. Now, in the Hayes paper, we talked a little bit again about that there's two sub-themes, and then that the first theme, right? So in this case, they're called themes, but they're codes or sub-themes. The first theme experienced by 6 out of 10 teacher interviewees. So now this is the first piece of evidence here, is that sometimes, and I wanted to give you this example, in your pilot study, this won't matter, but in your dissertation, it might. People ask you, well, how many of your participants said this? And this is especially the case in an interview study. How many, like, was it only 1 or was it 10? All right, so in this case, 6 out of 10. And then here's the claim. Accountability to standardized tests was, I'm gonna actually use this here, was an important arbiter of practices for several teachers. And then there's actually some sub claims, right? Some teachers felt tremendous pressure from accountability in trying to implement EE. And then other teachers, or on the other hand, Carlos said students would do better on the test after participating in stewardship. So those are the two kind of claims that are being made here. So the claim about teachers feeling tremendous pressure from accountability, again, same thing. I'm sitting with someone at coffee and they're like, really? Like, how do you know that? Maybe the skeptical friend, right? And I say, well, the teacher said, we have the tests that are coming up and a lot of teachers are freaking out about this new test. They feel they have to put everything else on the back burner because they have to get this done, right? So I can tell my skeptical friend, here is what this teacher described. And remember, I've also told my skeptical friend that 6 out of 10 teachers mentioned stuff like this, all right? And then for my next claim, claim number 2, students will do better on the test after participating in stewardship. He says, there are advantages. So I'm telling my friend, you know, I know you're skeptical about this, but this teacher said there are advantages. I believe that the students do better on the tests when environmental stewardship is integrated into the curriculum. All right, so my friend can maybe relax and be like, okay, all right, I see what you're saying. Like, you gave a couple of example quotes, you've supported your claim with evidence. Now, in this case, the reasoning is not in the findings. It's just a claim, evidence, all right? The reasoning is in the discussion. So I'm gonna show you how that does. So in this paragraph of the discussion, I get into the reasoning about the organizational context. And so I'm gonna make a very big claim. We found that the external domain of policy and organizational context played a pivotal role to understand why we drew on sense-making theory. So remember, that word reasoning is why, right? Like, why is this happening? Why is Carlos and this other teacher talking about accountability in this way? To examine, so I talk about theory, and then I say, here teachers' sense-making of the integration of standards and stewardship allowed them to carry out their beliefs in practice, contributing to the significant shift in the alignment between belief and practice that was demonstrated in the quantitative data. So essentially, I'm laying out how sense-making allows us to understand, actually, I should have probably read this part as well, that teachers felt under pressure from testing in some context, others felt this responsibility, and I'm citing the literature here, and then I say they were sense-making, right? And then I get more and further into the literature around this intersection of their beliefs and all kinds of things. So this is the reasoning around why we're seeing this pattern in the data that's in the theme. Okay, another thing that you need to do and make sure to do in the findings is to unpack quotes. So I'm gonna actually just show that to you in the Hayes article. When qualitative researchers have quotes, they don't just, so you'll notice that findings aren't just a bunch of quotes plunked in, right? The quotes are used explicitly to support a claim. So that's number one, they're used explicitly to support a claim. But also, quotes can be often unpacked in some ways, all right? So for example, I'm gonna just choose a different tool here so I can highlight for you. Here I've got a claim, even when teachers did not talk about accountability pressure, the melding of NGSS standards and stewardship was an external justification. And then I've got some quotes, right? Here's a quote from one teacher, and then a similar statement from another teacher. And notice that I introduced the quote a little bit. Liz noted how stewardship allowed her to tie it all together, what they required to teach and what they want to teach. So I introduced the quote, and then, this is very important, I unpacked all the quotes together. I said, these teachers all use words such as connected, tied together, and integration. Such a conceptualization corresponds to a growing evidence that coherence is a key element of successful reform. So I didn't just plunk a bunch of quotes in. I made a careful claim. I gave a couple of pieces of evidence where I introduced the quote, and then I kind of talked about the quotes together. And actually, I lied. This is a little piece of reasoning here. This last bit is connecting it to the literature, that there's this coherence. The reason why the teachers are, I'm making this claim, this is the evidence, connecting them together is this idea that coherence is probably a key element of reform, and that this is in the literature. So hopefully in your findings, I will see this kind of pattern where you have a claim, you're providing some evidence, you're unpacking the evidence a little bit, and then in your discussion, at least you're tying it back to theory. So if you'd like to, right now, you could take a moment to try it out, to take some of your graphic organizer, take one category, one theme, create an outline using the main codes or processes or narratives, write your main claim for each of the codes, and then find a couple of examples to demonstrate that claim. Hopefully those are already in your graphic organizer. Then you unpack and interpret each example, and then you summarize the main idea of each code and the entire theme, just like that. Your memos should help you with that. So here's an example of what it might look like, right? You've got your main claim or your theme, then you've got your subcategory claim and your evidence that would demonstrate, then your interpretation of that evidence, right? Then you've got another claim, your evidence that would demonstrate, your interpretation of that evidence. So even though the Hayes paper and the Narian paper are actually very different in audience and they seem different in format, they're actually not that different, right? They both are making claims, using evidence to support that claim, and connecting that ultimately to theory and to the literature and trying to explain why something is happening. All right. Let's see. When you write your findings, this is for folks in the pilot study, just a reminder that you only need to write up one theme with maybe a couple of sub themes or codes, and of course include the quotes and so forth. And then you need a section where you talk a little bit about the relationship between a couple of themes, just to try out how you talk about the relationships between things going on in your paper. I'm actually going to skip the part on writing your analysis paragraphs. You can revisit, you can actually look at these slides if you would like to look at just some example paragraphs for an analysis paragraph. These are examples, or you can pause them and read them. And just one final note that's pretty important for dissertation or a pilot study is that you avoid plagiarism, and that before you turn it into me, you upload it to turn it in and you test it yourself. So I'm giving you agency to test it yourself so you don't get turned back. This is super important. You don't want more than 4 or 5 words in a row that are taken from someone else's work. So just there's tools on Blackboard for you to upload your article and you can have a look yourself. I would like all of you to do that before you turn it in to me through Turn It In, so that I don't have to send it back to you. All right, that is the end of this presentation. Hopefully it was helpful, and I will see you soon.